Good afternoon, or depending upon where you are in the world, good morning. I am Dr. Steve Perry. I'm super excited to join you today live from where I am, Bridgeport, but also live from the King Center, where we are celebrating the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday 2023. Today, the conference it starts with me, cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. Beloved Community Global Summit, Day 2 General Summit, session number 4. I'm excited because I get to be joined by some very compelling panelists. But I want to take a quick moment to introduce myself. I am an educator from Connecticut who runs schools in New York and Connecticut, charter schools in New York, Connecticut. I'm Dr. Steve Perry. And I come to this work as a child of the 60s. On my birth certificate in 1969, it says Negro. And as a child of the 60s, one of the things that I have learned throughout my life is that race and racism are, quite frankly, still the scourge of a community. Not our community, but those communities that spread it upon us. So today we're going to have a conversation with our panelists who will bring you their perspective on the topic of racism. Racism is a catastrophe, a conundrum for millenniums. To eradicate it, we will need a way of thinking much higher than the level on which racism festered and multiplied. This interactive conversation will guide participants in contemplating and planning for how a beloved community mindset helps to understand and eradicate racism. All right. I'm going to take a quick second to read a quote of Dr. King's that speaks to me. And the quote is this: racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. It is the arrogant assertion that one race is the center of all value and object of devotion, before which all other races must kneel into submission. It is the absurd dogma that one race is responsible for all the progress of history and alone can assume the progress of the future. Racism is total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual or physical homicide upon the outgroup. I want to begin to introduce our guests. Thank you so much. I'm going to work my way around. Thank you for joining us today. Our first panelist is going to introduce himself, Jamar Tisby, Dr. Tisby.
Greetings, everyone. Pleased to be with you all on this panel. My name is Dr. Jamar Tisby. I'm an author, I'm a historian, and I'm a professor of history at the historic Simmons College of Kentucky.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tisby. Sis, I'm going to do my best to pronounce your name. Please correct me when I say it wrong, because I tend to. Birgit Uwele Umagba.
Thank you very much. I am so honored to be on this platform. My name is Birgit Umagba. I am a registered nurse and a clinical nurse specialist. I live in Ontario, Canada. I am also a social justice advocate, and I highlight the issues of racism in nursing and in healthcare. Thank you very much. What an honor to be amongst an esteemed group of people.
Thank you very much, Sister Umagba. And then we have a beautiful young couple, Reverend and Mrs. Joyce Johnson. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. I am Mrs. Mother, Joyce Hobson Johnson, and
I am Nelson Johnson, a retired pastor, but an organizer all of my life beginning in the mid-50s up until the present moment. It's good to be with you, and I look forward to a rich, enlightening conversation.
And we're speaking to you from the beloved community center that is grounded in the principles that Dr. King and others shared with us during the 60s movement.
That's fantastic. All right. So I'm going to start, if it's all right with you, with Reverend and Mrs. Johnson, retired pastor. I want to see how you do that one.
It's just a word, man.
That's impressive. So the first question is to you. What is racism, and what are the ways that it is contrary to the beloved community mindset, which prioritizes people over things and others over self, and uses power and love as a means to equity and justice?
Well, I think the definition that you read is a very accurate one. It's a set of beliefs on which people act that belittles the dignity and the worth and the value of all groups except themselves. And not only is that some kind of thing in people's head, it is a way of life. It actually subjugates, mistreats, abuses, and then lie about it. So all of this is wrapped up in the U.S. experience of racism, and I imagine the international experience of racism. And it must be confronted with compassion, with love, but with fierce determination and with clarity on the moment that we're in and the possibilities in this moment. And let me just end this by saying there's great danger. That's what we see. But on the other side of every great danger is a great opportunity.
Yes.
There's a massive opportunity now to pull together the diversities of people who are able to see and who are willing to work together and walk together. That's what I feel is so important about this conversation and about this moment.
Thank you so much. I want to go to Dr. Tisby. The question is, why is there such a misunderstanding or garbled understanding of what racism is and isn't? Let me continue. And how do we increase understanding of the power dynamics, deep roots, and perpetual outcomes of racism, including in medicine, healthcare, banking, education, and in corporate practices, as well as, of course, the criminal justice system?
Thank you for that question. I think fundamentally, why is there such a misunderstanding of racism? I think fundamentally, it's due to a resistance to truth telling and truth accepting. It is remarkable today in the information age how resistant people are to knowledge and truth when it challenges their ideologies and assumptions, of course. So increasingly, we are living in different epistemological ecosystems. What that means is we are not only in information bubbles, we are in belief bubbles. That is to say that when we get knowledge and information, if it doesn't fit a particular narrative that we already have on ideological grounds, most typically, then we reject that information. And this is not an issue that is equally dispersed among people of all persuasions. We can look at the disagreement around basic facts and information. And you can look at instances like the COVID pandemic and whether we should wear a mask. You can look at instances like the election in 2020 and whether that was legitimate or supposedly stolen. These are issues that go beyond intellectual capacity for people to understand. These are issues about identity. And increasingly, our identities are different, which makes it harder to come together, even on something like defining what racism is. In addition, you have the fact that racism never goes away, it just adapts. So many people are looking at racism from 60 or 70 years ago, having signs over drinking fountains, having separate entrances for Black people and other people of color, and saying, well, since all of that's supposedly gone, at least in a legal and overt sense, well, then we must not be dealing with racism. And now it's all just up to the individual. It's all due to your own effort. So we have a very heavy lift to continually define our terms and continually bring those up in conversation and dialogue so that we can actually make progress.
Thank you. Sister Umegba, am I saying, how close am I?
You're close. You're close.
Okay, I'm working on it. I'm gonna get there by the end of this.
Oh my God. Yes.
Umaigba. Okay,
Yes.
Umaigba. What type of education and on what platforms will help change mindsets that acquiesce and facilitate racism?
You know, I would like to start with Dr. Martin Luther King's quote: "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane because it often results in physical death." I navigate my profession as a nurse, as a Black African woman, and I have seen firsthand what racism does to patients, to colleagues who are Black, who are Indigenous, or of other racialized identities. And it is so harmful. And the fact that on an individual level, people have no understanding or an intentional denial that racism permeates every aspect of the Canadian healthcare system. Um, we know the studies show that the Canadian health system is built on colonial policies that perpetuate racism through power imbalances and social exclusion. Colonialism is embodied in the nursing educational system, in organizational structures, in healthcare programs and practices built on perspectives of the dominant Western culture and poorly adapted to the needs of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people. So, if there's a lack of understanding of how these policies work to put Black people at risk, then there needs to be a transformation on how nurses and health workers are educated way before they get into the healthcare system. So, health leaders have a moral and ethical obligation to, first of all, undertake the difficult process of introspection. People have to look into themselves. I know that a lot of people have this white exceptionalism view where they think that I am the good one, I'm not racist, I'm looking out for racism over there. However, people have to do the work that, regardless of how they perceive themselves, there needs to be education on a personal level. And then when we come to institutions, racism in nursing cannot be tackled without infusing intersectionality and clinical critical pedagogy into the nursing education and practice. I went through nursing school here in Canada, and I don't remember ever being taught racism in healthcare or how it puts certain people at a disadvantage. I have seen I've read on papers, I've seen on the news how people have died from racist practices in healthcare. So curriculums have to change to
What
infuse
would be an example?
anti-racist education, and that will be on an educational level. And on a political level, there needs to be a shift on who is given power. There needs to be a representation on political levels, recognizing the influence of one's privilege and position of power within the healthcare system, and making sure that Black voices, Indigenous voices, and other racialized voices are represented and at
Yes,
policy levels, and these population are given the resources and tools to be able to function So I do think that people also have social media is such a great movement. People can use your platforms to provide education and create more awareness on racism and racist practices in healthcare.
I just want to jump in here. I just want to jump in here. And a quick question, a quick follow up here. What's an example of a racist practice in healthcare? Tell how would a patient, how would social activists, how would a hospital be able to distinguish between a professional decision and a racist decision?
Okay, that's a very good question. We all hold stereotypes and biases. There are so many examples, but I am going to give the example where, for example, Black women are often perceived as angry, the angry Black woman stereotype. And when it comes to healthcare, when Black women present with pain, there's already this narrative that they're overreacting. And in an attempt to describe, I went through this myself as a Black patient within the Canadian healthcare system. In an attempt to express that emotion of pain, we are already dehumanized because we're already put in this bubble that we are angry and Black, and digging deeper into the stereotype, the history of which spans into the spheres of academia and popular culture. It is so easy for it has been disseminated, and people feel like we're not truthful about our pain and our suffering, and as a result we're neglected and left to suffer in pain. When I had a horrible miscarriage, which was, by the way, on paper, so it's no secret. I was dismissed. I was disregarded in my pain, and in an effort not to be viewed as angry, even though I was suffering, I was suppressing how much I
So,
could express, and
so
so
there's a,
this and many more in healthcare, we see that it's really easy to distinguish if
okay.
only they want to see it.
So I would love really. First of all, I'm sorry for your miscarriage. And the experience that you had. I would love to have a much deeper conversation with you about that because I think that many of us don't recognize that even, you know, in the US, we look at the Canadian system as ideal. And here in our country, we have some of the same racist underpinnings. But I wanted to move on to Mother Johnson, if I may. How do you, or how can we work on hearts and mindsets at the same time that we transform unjust systems, including by way of legislation? Because as Dr. King Jr. said, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me. Religion and education will have to do that, but it can restrain him from lynching me. So how can we work the hearts and mindsets at the same time transform unjust situations through the legal through legislation?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I'd like to change that to not simply how can we, but we must do this.
Okay.
This is essential to the concept of beloved community, where the heart, the spirit is in leadership as opposed to what transactionally or politically or what the polls say makes sense for us to do at any particular time. So we really must embrace the fact that we're all equal. We're made from the same source. And of course, some of our religious institutions no longer teach that. But we have to recognize that how you are faring has an impact on how I am ultimately faring. What Sister Magba experienced is something that many others of us have experienced, and has its impact all over the world. So knowing that the well-being of your sibling, whether you know that person, whether they're a different race or whatever, is also an impact on you. And that it's also a mandate for anybody who has a spiritual background. But at the same time, we know much of this is long-term. There's a lot of re-education that has to go on based on truth and possibility. But the essential pieces, like at the Beloved Community Center, we have a simple mission: is to work together alongside other people to forge and continuously expand a quality of leadership and beloved community to help guide Greensboro, our city, our state, and our nation into a new era of equitable economic sufficiency. The world is not lacking, it's the way we distribute it. Peace, social, gender, and racial justice that can serve as a model for others and an inspiration for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, our region, and our nation. So while we are striving for what people see as high ideals, we've got to work to implement some examples of that. The reversal of Roe v. Wade was a step backwards, but we need to use that reality as a possibility for now moving even further than what that had offered, so that we expand Medicaid, for example, in my state where it is not so. We have to look at the small earnings that have happened in the economic equity of areas like Fight for 15, now called the Union of Southern Service Workers, so that pay is equitable. We found out during the COVID season, which is still here and growing, that essential workers certainly are doctors and others, but it's also those people who clean the hallways, people who cook the food, people who deliver things. So we've got to realize that every human has something to offer and fight for that, because their well-being is intricately tied to our well-being. So we've got to do both and fight for those hard pieces that seem intractable, but our hearts and our spirits fuel us to continually push for them.
Mother Johnson, would you also say that we have to start to grow our own politicians?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Here at the Beloved, we appreciate the comment of the young couple. We've been married for over 53 years now. Looking forward to another one in May, Lord willing. But much of what we do when we interact with younger people is to say to them, you are what you've been looking for. You've got to take the lead. So it's very important to criticize those who are currently in power, but you've got to have this vision of what can be, what must be for your future and that of your children, and then work in the various venues, whether it's the local school board, the water board, which is increasingly a problem, Detroit, Jackson, Mississippi, all these places, and learn what you must do. But guess what? It's not about you just being so smart. It's really staying connected to the people in your communities who really know many of the solutions, but are not a part of the democratic or so-called democratic conversation. So we've got to build this movement that's people-based, and then a few of us will be selected to have political leadership. But we need spiritual leadership. We need educational leadership. We certainly need medical leadership, all areas, and the artistic, the arts, the songs, the music, all those things can touch the heart and really expand our understanding. So again, it's not just facts and figures, but really the essence of our humanity.
So Mother Johnson, one of the things I hear you saying is that, yes, we need to grow our own in terms of political activism, but also grow our own from mindsets that we believe across all platforms, in all industries. You bring up a really powerful point, one that I think that is often overlooked. Sure, racism has driven some of the decisions that have occurred that made the water situation. I mean, in America, that we're talking about water is both the epitome of racism and the and what's called the King Center calls it the catastrophe and conundrum that was millenniums in the making. Like, this didn't just happen,
right?
But that's the flowery platitude. But in a very practical sense, as you said, you got to sit on your town's water commission. You got to sit on inland wetlands. You got to get on those committees. You got to be part of the solution. Because one thing to say our water's filthy, But if we've never put a person on one of those committees or commissions, then on some level, by omission, we've allowed something to happen to us that we could, by and large, correct. And I hear you saying it's not. I think that's a powerful example that can be easily overlooked, given the fact that how many people want to volunteer once a month to go and sit through inland wetlands?
Yes.
But one day you look up and somebody's driving digging a trench to put a freeway through your backyard, and now you wonder how that happened. Well, every month they had an inland wetlands meeting. We didn't have a single person from our community, to your point, connected to our community, who was connected to that decision. Public meetings, public meeting records, and there it is. Now we're trying to fight where the road's going to go after the first trench has been dug. I want to come back to you, Dr. Tisby. I want to ask, in what ways can the viewers joining us today influence their minds, their homes, and their communities to come up from racism, particularly as an outcome of white supremacist ideology? And the second part of that is, how can we not be vessels for racism? So how can we train others to not, how can we come up from it? And how can we make sure that other people don't end up there?
So let me, as a historian, give a plug for history. How can we not be racist? How can we help other people not be racist? We've got to know our stories. That's what history is. It's the story of us long before the television show came around, right? And let me read from James Baldwin. He said, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do." And so one of the things historians say is that everything has a history. And when we learn that history, we learn that so much of it is tied to white supremacy and racism. This was the controversy over the 1619 Project. Some folks didn't want to actually go back and look that racism and race-based chattel slavery was a foundation of what became the United States before it even was the United States. So a very practical someone can do is look at history. And if you want to know where to start, a couple of things. Number one, start with your interests. A lot of people erroneously think history is boring. History is fascinating. And if you don't believe me, find something you're interested in and learn the history of it. And secondly, what we can do is look at books that are published at academic and university presses. So in other words, if you go to your few brick and mortar bookstores left, but like a Barnes and Noble or something, unfortunately, it's a lot of non-historians writing about history, which turns into mostly propaganda. If you want a little bit more disciplined history, a lot more disciplined history, look at history books that are published by academic and university presses, just to begin. Now, that's just one practical thing. Overall, I think this deal of fighting racism is so contextual. Your community versus my community versus someone else's community, it's going to have different contours. And so instead of giving you a bullet point list of do this, do that, do the other, I think in terms of a framework. I wrote about this in my second book, How to Fight Racism. It talks about the arc of racial justice. The arc of racial justice is an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. Awareness, relationship, commitment. I think, like legs of a stool, you need all three to have a stable platform on which to build your racial justice efforts. Awareness is everything that we do to build awareness, everything we do to gain knowledge and information. It's watching the documentaries, it's listening to a presentation like this, it's reading the books. And we saw an explosion of that in 2020. That's great, but you can't stop there. You just have a big head. We also need big hearts. That's where the relationship component is. You know, I was studying the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, and it is so interesting connecting the dots of who knows who and where. These dots cross racial lines, cross gender lines, cross class lines, and it was a relational effort that led to the systemic change of the abolition of slavery. And so we can never forget the importance of relationships of linking arms together with one another and seeing the humanity in each other. And then lastly is commitment. And by commitment, I don't simply mean staying the course. By commitment, I mean committing ourselves to changing systems and policies that continue to oppress people and disenfranchise people and commit injustices toward people, even apart from the explicit intentions of an individual. So that goes to things like voting rights and mass incarceration and all of these ills in healthcare that we've been talking about. We need awareness, relationships, and commitment. And these things are happening continuously. But I'll end with this. If you don't know where to start, get in what I call priestly proximity to somebody who's different. In other words, anyone you can look at who has stood up for justice, they have had some personal encounter with people who were adversely affected by the injustice. That developed empathy and that developed motivation for them to take action. So look at your local network. Who are you in relationship with, especially who's different, that you might develop a burden for as you carry your neighbor's burden and love your neighbor?
Thank you so much, Dr. Tisby. Pastor, I'm going to come back to you. Even if you are retired, I'm going to pull you out for a minute. We have talked about racism as that which is promulgated on Black people from the lighter society. But it is we who refer to each other, as Mother Johnson said, in our arts. If we think about our arts, we have to put people in our arts who speak to us as we want to be spoken to. In our communities, we have to be people who treat each other well. Can you talk about internalized racism within the Black community and how we might confront that also?
Absolutely. And I think that is a moral, spiritual question as well. An experience we had of street groups, some people call them gangs. We chose not to use that term, who were doing things that were not healthy for the community. But when you get on the ground floor and you connect with one of the leaders, there's a potential for a depthful discussion. And we had that and brought together 6 neighborhood groups who signed a peace treaty related to they would not instigate any violence and that they would actually start a cleanup campaign in the community for graffiti that was put out. And they were names that you would recognize: the Crips, the Bloods, the 5 Percenters, the Almighty Latin King and Queen Nation. Here's what happened. As a result of that initiative, and I don't want to end the story here because it's still going, the police came down on the leadership of that in such a way that it breaks my heart even to talk about it, and gave that young man 28 years in prison because somebody went across state lines, bought something, and came back and said he told them to do it. And they had a whole case, a RICO case, about a local thing. So what I'm saying is that we have to take the initiative in our own communities to help heal the historical wounds inflicted on us by this brutal, evil system of racism that included chattel slavery but never stopped. I think that's important. But at the same time, I think we have to look at what is feeding and fueling this propensity really among the white population. And I want to name something that's in our book of faith. It says you cannot serve 2 gods. You can't do it. And that the God of our culture is money. And actually at this point in time, a certain amount of money is feeding into our community in ways that are questionable, in ways that actually limit what we are willing to do and able to do, and bring it under a certain kind of, how can I say, not too healthy way of getting through this period. So I want to name that. In the 60s, most of this 501c3 money went to libraries and music halls and all of that. SNCC got going and they start funding them and then pitted them against each other. And I think that we have to build the unity of our community in spite of, and I don't want anything that I said to suggest that it can't be done. It simply access the urgency of doing it, not that it can't be done. And we believe that the faith community has a major role to play in that once it finished talking about the fast train to heaven. How about the train to justice on earth? How do we build that as the bedrock of the faith? And then to build relationship between neighborhood groups, between faith groups, between labor groups, and between social justice groups, and between other groups that are moving. That's the challenge right now. And it has to be done in a concentrated way with specific focus on a certain geographic region that you can transform things. That's why we've set up the North Carolina Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission process, where we're pulling in the state churches, pulling in labor unions, pulling in social justice groups, pulling in environmental groups. We must walk toward each other. We must walk toward each other, and on that walk, build quality, enduring relationship that no money, that no funding, that no jive-talking person can get between us and the unity that we're building. That's the challenge that I see. It's one thing to talk about the damage racism is doing. It's another thing to talk about how we engage it and build toward enduring solutions. That's what we're committed to here in North Carolina. And we want to invite everybody to think along those lines, never dismissing the cause, but the cause is not the cure. You have to have a cure related to the actuality of how this thing is being administered. It includes the electoral part, but unless you have a base among ordinary people, the people in elected offices are very limited in what they're capable of doing, even if they want to do it. And some of them actually lean the other way. So I hope that that speaks to your question.
It does.
I'm passionate about that because it has to be done. You cannot get there without building the unity of the most affected people. And that unity will open the door to build relationship with poor whites. I worked on a textile mill, getting $3 and change an hour. White people were getting $3.15 or 20 more cents change an hour. So your position ain't much better than mine. And so we have some potential to unite if you can get across this false teaching that you're better than somebody. Let me stop before I don't.
No, let me say that I know that a pastor's getting worked up when he starts talking about jive talking people. So I know things have gone miserably wrong when we gone there. What I want to do is I want to go around. We have a couple minutes left until we get to the top of the hour. But one of the characteristics of Dr. King that I most admired was his ability and willingness to call to the carpet his own community as a specifically related to pastors. The letter from a Birmingham prison could not have been a more compelling example of that. Rare is the occasion that a person who is of the cloth or of academia or of the medical profession, rare is that any of us will speak against our own for fear of at least severing our ability to earn, which in the land of serving two gods, we know which one most folks are going to choose. So what I want to do is I want to start at the top in Canada with Sister Umagba. You started to talk a bit about this. What specifically today could nurses in Canada in particular do to begin to eradicate racism in the delivery of healthcare on their shift today? those nurses are in the hospital today. What could they do today? By the end of the shift, they will be one less racist nurse.
Thank you very much. This is such an important question because we're used to getting a lot of, suggestions of what to do and so many things to do. Today, what one nurse could do to be anti-racist is to start by practicing self-reflection. We are taught self-reflection in schools. We've talked here about history and, introspection. You cannot, according to the author Layla said, you cannot challenge what you do not understand. And you really cannot dismantle what you think does not exist. So the practice of self introspection begins with understanding what racism really is. If my colleague really cares about that Black patient, that Indigenous patient, or that Black colleague who has expressed trauma regarding their racist experience, then that person should sit and say, what is my role and how can I effect a change on my unit to be able to provide anti-racist care? And how am I adding to the racial trauma of my colleagues and patients? So understanding racism and how it is infused into every aspect of healthcare is a starting point.
Okay.
There's absolutely no way to dismantle it if you don't even understand that it exists. So realizing that it exists, it's really not. A lot of times when we talk about racism, people think it's only at an individual level. The system is racist. The way they hire nurses into leadership is completely racist. The hiring practices.
Now we're talking.
Yes. So starting by what exactly I can do, I practice self-reflection and going from there and sitting with that discomfort, because it's very easy not to want to be uncomfortable in practicing the self-reflection. But I challenge my colleagues to sit with the discomfort and see how they can impact a change.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Tisby, today at Smith, at right now, whatever time it is, you said you're in Kentucky?
Yes, sir.
So in Kentucky, right now at Smith College, what could your college do today? Like today, while y'all still got, well, maybe on the college campus, the day might be over, but presuming that y'all work a traditional schedule.
We always working, yes.
That is, then what could and I got 11 minutes, so I want to make sure I get back to Pastor and Mother Johnson. What could you do today on campus? What could your administration, what could you do today to impact racism?
Well, I think Black institutions like historically Black colleges and universities, Simmons College, where I work, we are doing that work day to day. What we're trying to inculcate and educate within our students is the idea that they are part of a stream of freedom fighters, of liberation leaders, and that they need to take up that mantle in the present day. So we can't just rely on what people have done in the past. We need to see ourselves not just as students of history, but as makers of history. So what I try to do in my class is not only give them the tools of academic history and critical inquiry, but to point them to the long tradition of Black scholars, clergy, activists who, whatever their vocation or field, the people we look up to and admire saw their work as being part of the Black freedom struggle and broader civil rights and humanitarian uplift. So what we need to do is help our young people understand that this stuff isn't over. It may have changed forms, but they are affected by it, and they can also be part of the solution. And to that effect, even if you're not a college student or at a Black institution, what you can do is support them. Current work and research I'm doing is on the endowments of HBCUs as compared to predominantly white institutions, and you would weep to see the discrepancies there. So if you want to support the people who are doing the work, especially the next generation of civil rights leaders, you can contribute to historically Black colleges and universities and support the work of these institutions that have historically contributed so much to the uplift, not only of people of African descent, but the entire nation.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to finish where we started with our truly-weds. They got newlyweds, and then they got truly-weds. And after 52 years, y'all are 53. Right, yeah, I better give you all your years. 53 years of marriage, you are truly weds. So my question to you is, both of you can answer it together. The church community, the Black church, what can the Black church do today? What can Black pastors in North Carolina today, in your community today, do to begin to beat back what our organizers have referred to as a catastrophe and a conundrum, millenniums in the making, or otherwise known as racism? What could y'all do today?
I'm going to start out with the question that was on the floor before, if you don't mind.
By all means.
Okay. And one thing I want to say is what we can do today, now, fierce urgency of now, is to stop believing in, operating off the lies. The emperor has no new clothes. The Wizard of Oz is not real. The power is within us if we are united. And we've got to believe that and walk like we believe that. As I think I was 20-year-old college student, really the first time I was 17 as a freshman, I had the life-changing experience of meeting Dr. King. And I was, Dr. Tisby, one of those students who did the integration. I was at Duke University, but it was very clear why I was there on behalf of our community, our large community, not just because I was so smart. We've been smart for years, but it's a matter of the oppression that kept us from really offering all that we could offer to the world. So I was fortunately clear on that from the education I received at my church, from the education I received in the streets as a 15-year-old marching in Richmond, Virginia, and other places, trained by folk like John Lewis and Vincent Harding in the nonviolent social justice techniques. So that's what I still carry in me. But I happened to be in a room when Dr. King had just gotten out of jail one time, and all the kids were there. So I remember King III, the Martin III, and Dexter, and Yolanda, Bernice, clinging to their parents. And of course, Sister King was there planning the Poor People's Campaign. So it was always justice linked to the people who were most impacted. So we've got to operate out of that and know that we can make a difference. And of course, churches play such a role in that. Reality is that people don't necessarily come to church the way they used to. Doesn't have to stay that way. We need to think about what we're teaching. Are we teaching the gospel of hope and possibility and the equality of all humankind, that the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, and that is available for all of us, including the animals and everything around us to make? There's an abundance that's been provided for us, but we submitted to this distribution process that allows all these inequities, oppression, deaths. And if we no longer believe that, shed that shroud of racism, those of us who are most impacted and those of us who think that we're benefiting from this oppressive system, we can do wonderful, powerful things. So I'm going to switch over then to the pastor and let him talk in more particular about how the church might do that. But realize that we're operating under a lie. We've got to dismantle that. And then we can come into our fullest potential.
Well, let me first affirm all of the good work that's going on across the nation that we haven't talked about and haven't named. Mm-hmm. And I don't want you to feel dismissed. So I want to affirm that on the one hand. as for the church, um, and I also want to affirm the importance of self-reflection. Nobody can reflect for you. They might reflect about you, but you have to reflect for yourself and to come to some sense of who I really am and what I'm called to do. As for the church, um, I think that the church has drifted away from one of the primary emphasis in the gospel, and that's the emphasis on justice. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. What is good news to the poor? Not getting poor, not sleeping under bridges, not having health care. That has to become central, not having a house. And so, in some sense, we've got to preach the depth of the gospel as it's given to us and mean it. Because after the talk, there has to be a walk. So you have to step into what it is you're preaching and proclaiming. It's in that spirit that we are inviting all the churches in North Carolina to join us in a statewide truth, justice, and reconciliation movement. You can help anchor this. And if you add to that uh, labor and the labor movement, who are struggling themselves, and bring that together. And if you can add to that young students and educators, and I'm painting a picture here because we have to see the potential in the moment, that we see something now that perhaps we couldn't see 8 or 10 years ago. And that is a bunch of people running up on the Capitol unapologetically, trying to overthrow the government. And in that sense, it's a moment. And the moment is, how do we use this energy and this failed set of policies to help us unite and grow into a powerful, transformative movement? If you can do it in one state, it will commend itself to the nation. And I think that's where we see things in North Carolina and how we understand our work. Without the church, it can't quite work. The church has to play a major role in it, and we believe that it will with a little help. Sometimes you have to kick people in the pants a little bit, get them moving. But I think that that potential is there. And if it happens in North Carolina, it can happen in the United States.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining this 2023 King Holiday Observance. It starts with me, cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. Beloved Community Global Summit, Day 2 General Summit, session number 4. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank all of our panelists who have brought their insights and thoughtfulness to the work that we do. But it's super important that we thank Dr. Bernice King,
Amen.
the organizer of this effort and the what I refer to lovingly as the Queen King. She, in her work, has decided to answer the call and to inspire generations that follow to do the same. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am humbled and honored to be a part of such a conversation, and I recognize that all healing begins with the conversation. So I thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who are interested, please stay tuned because more panelists are to follow. And while I'm sure that none will be as cool as this one, I'm sure they'll be great. Y'all take it easy. Thank you so much. We love you.
Thank you, Doc.
My pleasure.
Thank you.